The emergency room doors burst open on a frigid December evening, causing heads to turn and whispers to fill the sterile air. A well-dressed elderly man in an expensive suit stumbled through, struggling to carry an unconscious person wrapped in tattered, dirt-stained clothes. The homeless man's matted gray beard was crusted with dried blood, his face barely visible beneath layers of grime. "Please, somebody help him," the businessman's voice cracked with desperation, his usually composed demeanor shattered by panic. "He's not breathing properly." The other patients in the waiting room pressed themselves against the walls, some covering their noses, others pointing and whispering with undisguised disgust. A young mother hurriedly pulled her children away, shooting a disapproving glance at the scene unfolding before them. "Sir, you can't bring him in here like this," a security guard stepped forward, his face twisted with concern and revulsion. "There are protocols." "To hell with your protocols," the businessman roared, his silver hair disheveled, hands trembling as he cradled the unconscious man's head. "This man needs immediate medical attention. I'll pay whatever it costs." The reception area fell silent, save for the businessman's labored breathing and the steady drip of melting snow from his expensive overcoat. His weathered face, usually commanding respect in corporate boardrooms, now pleaded with anyone who would meet his eyes. "He's just another junkie," someone muttered from the crowd. "Why waste time and resources?" The businessman's eyes flashed with fury. "This man," he declared, his voice cutting through the murmurs of judgment, "is worth more than everyone in this room combined. And if none of you will help him, I'll find someone who will." Just then, the homeless man's body began to convulse, and a thin trail of blood trickled from the corner of his mouth. The businessman's face drained of color as he clutched his friend tighter, tears threatening to spill from his eyes. What happened next would change not only their lives, but the entire community's perception of compassion, judgment, and the true meaning of human dignity. But at that moment, in the harsh fluorescent lights of the emergency room, no one could have predicted the extraordinary series of events that were about to unfold. 6 months earlier, on a bitter January morning, snow blanketed the financial district of the city. The businessman, James, hurried toward his office building, his polished shoes crunching through fresh snow. At 72, he still maintained his daily routine of being the first to arrive at his company, just as he had done for the past 4 decades. The dawn light barely penetrated the heavy clouds when he noticed something unusual near the building's service entrance. A figure huddled against the wall, wrapped in layers of tattered blankets, seeking shelter from the biting wind. Normally, security would have removed any homeless people from the property, but at this early hour, even they hadn't arrived yet. James found himself slowing his pace, something about the scene tugging at his consciousness. The temperature had dropped well below freezing overnight, and the weather forecast warned of an approaching winter storm. The huddled figure shivered violently, clutching what appeared to be a worn leather notebook to his chest. "Excuse me," James called out, surprising himself. "Are you all right?" The man looked up, and James was struck by the intelligence in his eyes, despite his disheveled appearance. His face, though weathered and lined with age, held a dignity that seemed at odds with his circumstances. The man attempted to speak, but his words came out as a hoarse whisper, his teeth chattering from the cold. Without thinking, James removed his cashmere scarf and offered it to the man. "Here, take this. You must be freezing." The homeless man hesitated, then slowly reached for the scarf with trembling hands. As he did so, his notebook fell open, revealing pages filled with complex chemical formulas and medical notations. James caught glimpses of detailed molecular diagrams and research notes before the man hastily closed it. "Thank you," the man managed to say, his voice carrying traces of refined education despite its roughness. "But why would you help someone like me?" Before James could respond, his building's security team arrived, immediately moving to escort the homeless man away. "Mr. Williams, sir," one guard called out, "we'll handle this right away. Sorry you had to deal with this situation." But James raised his hand, stopping them. "No, wait." He turned back to the homeless man. "Would you like to come inside for a coffee? Warm up a bit?" The security guards exchanged concerned glances. A young executive entering the building scoffed audibly, whispering to her colleague about enabling vagrants. Others passing by stared openly, their judgmental expressions making their opinions clear. James ignored them all, maintaining eye contact with the homeless man, who seemed torn between desperation and pride. Finally, the man nodded slightly, clutching his mysterious notebook tighter. As James helped him up, he noticed the man's hands. Despite their dirt and roughness, they bore the distinctive calluses of someone who had spent countless hours holding a pen and working with laboratory equipment. But more striking was the gold ring on his finger, its surface tarnished but still visible, a medical caduceus symbol. What James didn't know then was that this simple act of kindness would set in motion a chain of events that would challenge everything he thought he knew about success, judgment, and the true measure of a person's worth. As they walked into the building together, the whispers and stares following them, neither man could have predicted how their lives were about to become inextricably linked in ways that would eventually leave an entire community in awe. Word quickly spread throughout James's company about his unusual guest. The pristine employee break room became a theater of raised eyebrows and hushed conversations as James sat with the homeless man, whom he learned was called Robert. Despite the man's weathered appearance, his manners remained impeccable as he carefully sipped the hot coffee. "Sir, your 9 a.m. board meeting." James's assistant hovered nervously at his elbow, casting uncertain glances at Robert. "Reschedule it," James replied firmly, watching as Robert's hand steadied enough to hold the cup without shaking. The assistant's shocked expression reflected in the window behind them. In 40 years, James had never rescheduled a board meeting. Over the next few hours, fragments of Robert's story emerged. His words came slowly at first, as if he was remembering how to engage in conversation. He spoke of advanced medical research, groundbreaking studies in neurodegenerative diseases, and a prestigious position at a renowned research facility. But whenever James pressed for more details, Robert would retreat into silence, clutching his notebook tighter. "You need proper clothes," James declared finally, ignoring the disapproving glances from employees passing by. "And a warm meal." That afternoon, James's regular lunch meeting at the exclusive Hamilton Club turned heads, for all the wrong reasons. Robert, though cleaned up and wearing a borrowed suit from James's car emergency kit, still bore the visible marks of life on the streets. The maitre d' almost refused them entry until he recognized James. "Dad, have you lost your mind?" James's son Thomas cornered him in the club's ornate bathroom. "First the office, now here? People are talking. The board members are concerned about your judgment." "Let them talk," James replied, straightening his tie. "That man in there has more intelligence and dignity in his little finger than half the people in this club." But the whispers grew louder. James's friends started avoiding his calls. Business associates suddenly became too busy for meetings. His daughter-in-law canceled their weekly family dinner, making excuses about the children catching a cold. Yet James persisted. He found Robert a room at a modest hotel, brought him fresh clothes, and most importantly, listened. With each passing day, the fog of survival mode seemed to lift from Robert's eyes, revealing more of the brilliant mind trapped beneath years of hardship. One evening, as they shared a simple dinner in James's office, Robert finally opened his notebook. "I need to show you something," he said, his hands trembling slightly as he turned to a specific page. "But you have to promise to keep it confidential." The complex diagrams and chemical formulas meant little to James, but the conviction in Robert's voice as he explained his research was unmistakable. This wasn't the ramblings of a broken man, this was something else entirely. "They said I was dangerous," Robert's voice cracked. "That my research was too radical. But they never understood what I was trying to achieve." Before James could respond, his son burst into the office, flanked by 2 board members. Their faces showed a mix of concern and determination. "Dad, this has gone far enough," Thomas declared. "We're calling an emergency board meeting tomorrow. Your behavior is affecting company morale and our stock prices." James looked at his son, then at Robert, who had already begun gathering his notebook, preparing to disappear back into the shadows. In that moment, James faced a choice that would define not just his legacy, but the very meaning of human compassion. "Tell the board I look forward to it," James replied calmly, his resolve strengthening. What he didn't tell them was that he had already begun investigating Robert's past, and what he had uncovered would shake their comfortable world to its core. The weight of silence filled James's private office as he spread out the documents across his mahogany desk. After weeks of quiet investigation, the truth about Robert's past had finally emerged, each piece more devastating than the last. 15 years ago, Robert had been Dr. Robert Henderson, a leading researcher at one of the country's most prestigious medical institutes. His work on neurodegenerative diseases had shown unprecedented promise, particularly a revolutionary treatment approach that could potentially slow or even halt the progression of several previously untreatable conditions. "Your research facility didn't just dismiss you, did they?" James asked softly, watching Robert's face as he stared at an old newspaper clipping. "They destroyed you." Robert's hands trembled as he touched the yellowed paper. The headline read, "Prominent researcher accused of falsifying data, millions in grant money at stake." Below it, a younger Robert stood proudly in a lab coat, his eyes bright with purpose. "My wife was dying," Robert's voice cracked. "Early onset Alzheimer's. She was only 48. The traditional treatments weren't working, and I knew my research could help her. But the institute wanted to move in a different direction, more profitable ventures." James listened as Robert described how he had continued his research in secret, using his own funds. But when he refused to abandon his work, things took a dark turn. Suddenly, there were accusations of data manipulation, missing research funds, and ethical violations. "They planted evidence," Robert explained, his voice hollow. "By the time I proved my innocence, my reputation was destroyed, my research funding was gone, and—" He paused, fighting back tears. "My wife had passed away. I couldn't save her." The documents in front of them told the rest of the story. Anonymous tips that turned out to be from competing researchers. Missing evidence that would have cleared his name. A systematic campaign to discredit a man whose only crime was refusing to give up on saving lives. "I kept working," Robert gestured to his notebook. "Living on the streets, but my mind never stopped. I've solved it now, the treatment protocol that could have saved her. But who would believe a homeless man?" Just then, James's office door opened. His son Thomas stood there, flanked by 2 security guards. "Dad, the board meeting is about to start." "They're waiting." James looked at the guards, then at his son's resolute expression. "You're really going to do this, aren't you? Force me out of my own company?" "It's for your own good," Thomas replied. "This obsession with helping this man, it has to stop. You're risking everything we've built." Robert quietly gathered his notebook, preparing to leave, but James placed a firm hand on his shoulder. "No," he said. "You're staying right here." He turned to his son. "And you're going to want to hear this. Because what I've discovered isn't just about Robert, it's about the entire pharmaceutical industry, and the lengths they'll go to protect their profits." As James rose to face the board, he knew he was about to put everything on the line, his company, his reputation, his relationship with his son. But looking at Robert, he saw something that mattered more than all of that, the chance to right a terrible wrong and, perhaps, save countless lives in the process. What no one in that room knew was that within 24 hours, events would unfold that would make their current crisis seem insignificant by comparison. Robert's past was about to collide with their present in a way that would leave them all forever changed. The morning after the board meeting, James walked into his office building to find his personal belongings being packed into boxes. Thomas had convinced the board to place him on temporary leave, citing concerns about his mental health and decision-making capacity. His support of Robert had been labeled as erratic behavior unbecoming of a CEO. "Your security clearance has been revoked," Mr. Williams, the head of security, informed him apologetically, someone who had worked for James for over 2 decades. "I'm sorry, sir, but those are the orders." The employees who had once greeted him warmly now averted their eyes, hurrying past with uncomfortable expressions. James stood in the lobby of the building he had built from the ground up, watching as 40 years of his life were systematically dismantled. You don't have to do this, Thomas approached him, his voice low and urgent. Just step back from this situation with the homeless man. Take a vacation. Get some perspective. The board will reinstate you. James looked at his son, really looked at him, seeing not the polished executive before him but the little boy who used to sit on his lap in this very office, drawing on spare pieces of letterhead. When did money become more important than doing what's right? This isn't about money. Thomas exploded, then lowered his voice as heads turned. This is about you throwing away everything you've built for a stranger. You don't even know if his story is true. But James had spent the previous night reviewing Robert's research notes in detail, with a trusted friend, a retired biochemist. The science was not only sound but potentially groundbreaking. The implications of Robert's work could revolutionize the treatment of neurodegenerative diseases. Outside the building, James found Robert waiting, his face etched with guilt. I never meant for this to happen, he said quietly. Perhaps it would be better if I... Don't you dare finish that sentence, James cut him off. We're not giving up. Not now. They spent the next few days working from James's home study, making calls to old contacts, trying to find someone willing to review Robert's research. But James's removal from his company had made waves in their business circle. Doors that had once been open to him were suddenly closed. Even James's wife, Eleanor, who had initially supported his efforts to help Robert, began to waver as their social circle crumbled. Their country club membership was quietly revoked. Friends stopped inviting them to dinner parties. Their names disappeared from charity gala guest lists. I just don't understand, Eleanor confessed one evening. Why risk everything for this? James took her hand, leading her to his study, where Robert's research lay spread out. Because 15 years ago, people with power and influence decided that profits were more important than saving lives. They destroyed a good man's life because he refused to give up on helping others. I won't be part of that system anymore. That night, as James worked late in his study, he received an urgent call from a former colleague now working at a major research hospital. James, you need to get down here right away, the voice was tense. Remember those files you asked me to review? I found something. Something big. But... The line went dead. Before James could process what had happened, his phone rang again. This time it was his home's security system. There had been a break-in at Robert's hotel room. By the time James arrived, the room had been ransacked, Robert's notebook was missing, and Robert himself lay unconscious on the floor, barely breathing. As James rode in the ambulance with Robert's motionless body, he realized that they had stumbled onto something much bigger and more dangerous than a simple case of professional sabotage. Someone was willing to go to extreme lengths to keep Robert's research from seeing the light of day. The emergency room scene that had opened our story now played out in full detail, but this time from James's perspective. His hands wouldn't stop shaking as he filled out Robert's admission forms, realizing he knew almost nothing about the man he'd risked everything to help, no family contacts, no insurance information, not even his social security number. Sir, we need more information, the nurse insisted, her voice tinged with both sympathy and frustration. Any medical history? Pre-existing conditions? James could only shake his head, his mind racing back to the ransacked hotel room, the missing notebook, the cut phone line. His friend at the research hospital wasn't answering calls. The emergency room doctor emerged from the trauma bay, his expression grave. Mr. Williams? We found something unusual in his preliminary scans. There's evidence of a sophisticated medical device implanted near his brain stem. It's unlike anything I've seen before. James felt the room spin. He steadied himself against the wall as the doctor continued. The device appears to be experimental. Given its location, it could be related to neurodegenerative disease research. But here's the strange part, the technology looks years ahead of anything currently approved for human trials. A memory flashed in James's mind, a page from Robert's notebook, diagrams of a neural interface designed to deliver targeted treatment directly to affected brain tissues. It was never about pharmaceutical drugs, James whispered. He was developing a completely new treatment approach. Just then, Robert's vital signs began to crash. The emergency room erupted into controlled chaos as medical staff rushed to stabilize him. Through the window, James watched helplessly as they worked, the monitors telling a story he couldn't fully understand. "We need to operate immediately," the doctor announced. But without knowing more about the device, it's extremely risky. One wrong move could cause catastrophic damage. As if on cue, the emergency room doors burst open. A team of suited men strode in, led by none other than Dr. Richardson, the former head of research at the institute that had destroyed Robert's career. "I'll take it from here," Richardson announced, flashing credentials. "This patient is part of an ongoing federal investigation. We'll be moving him to a secure facility." James stepped between them and Robert's room. "Like hell you will." "What are you really afraid of, Richardson? That people will learn the truth about what you did to him?" The doctor interrupted their standoff. "Gentlemen, I don't care about your politics or investigations. My patient is dying. In the next few minutes, I need to know exactly what that device is and how it works, or we're going to lose him." Richardson's face paled. Despite his bravado, he clearly had no idea how Robert's device actually functioned. James could see the calculation in his eyes. Would he rather risk Robert dying than admit his ignorance? Just then, James's phone buzzed. A text from an unknown number. "Check your email." Found his backup files. "Hurry." Time seemed to freeze as James faced the biggest gamble of his life. In his inbox lay the potential key to saving Robert's life, but accessing it meant exposing revolutionary medical research to the very people who had tried to bury it. As the monitors continued their urgent beeping, James realized that once again, he would have to choose between protecting himself and doing what was right. What happened in the next few hours would not only determine Robert's fate but would unravel a conspiracy that reached into the highest levels of the medical establishment. The truth was about to come out, and nothing would ever be the same. James's fingers flew across his phone's keyboard, forwarding the encrypted files to his private email while simultaneously showing the doctor the crucial technical specifications for Robert's device. The emergency room transformed into a battlefield of competing interests, the medical team fighting for Robert's life, Richardson and his men trying to contain the situation, and James standing guard, ensuring no one interfered with the desperate surgery. "This is remarkable," the doctor muttered, studying the technical documents between giving orders to his team. "The precision of this neural interface, the targeted delivery system, it's at least a decade ahead of current technology." Richardson paced the waiting room, making heated phone calls, his face growing increasingly ashen as he realized he was losing control of the situation. Several times, he tried to approach the operating room, only to be blocked by hospital security, who, thanks to James's reputation in the community, chose to honor his medical proxy rights over Richardson's government credentials. Hours crept by. James's son Thomas arrived, having heard about the emergency through family connections. He stood awkwardly in the waiting room, shifting between concern for his father and lingering doubt about the situation. "Dad," Thomas finally spoke, his voice quiet. "The board members have been calling. They've seen the preliminary research data you forwarded to the hospital. They want to know if they made a mistake." Before James could respond, a commotion erupted at the emergency room entrance. A distinguished-looking elderly woman burst through the doors, followed by what appeared to be federal agents. "Where is he?" she demanded, her voice carrying the weight of authority. "Where is Dr. Robert Henderson?" The woman introduced herself as Judge Catherine Morrison, and the revelation of her identity changed everything. 15 years ago, she had been part of a sealed federal investigation into medical research fraud. An investigation that had been mysteriously shut down just as it was uncovering evidence of widespread corruption. "We've been building this case for years," she explained to James, her eyes fierce despite her age. Dr. Henderson's research wasn't just suppressed, it was stolen. The neural interface technology he developed? Certain pharmaceutical companies have been secretly developing it, planning to patent it for themselves once enough time had passed that no one would connect it to him. Richardson tried to slip away during the chaos, but the federal agents were faster. As they led him away in handcuffs, the full scope of the conspiracy began to emerge. Falsified evidence, buried research, orchestrated character assassination, all to protect billions in potential profits. The doctor emerged from surgery, exhausted but smiling. He's stabilized. The device is functioning properly now that we understand how it works. But there's something else you need to see. On the operating room's imaging screens, they could see Robert's device in action. It wasn't just treating the symptoms of neurodegeneration, it was actively repairing damaged neural pathways. The implications were staggering. He did it, James whispered, tears in his eyes. He actually did it. As Robert was moved to recovery, Judge Morrison placed a hand on James's shoulder. We'll need his testimony once he recovers. Years of criminal conspiracy, corruption at the highest levels, it's going to shake the entire medical industry. Thomas, who had witnessed everything, approached his father. Dad, He struggled with the words. I'm sorry. I should have trusted you. But James's attention was focused on the recovery room monitor, where Robert's vital signs were growing stronger by the minute. Sometimes, he realized, it takes losing everything to discover what really matters. The real question was, what would they do with the truth once Robert woke up? 3 days after the surgery, Robert opened his eyes to a world that had dramatically shifted during his unconsciousness. His hospital room, far from the lonely space he had expected, was filled with activity. Teams of legitimate researchers pored over his recovered research data, their excitement barely contained as they verified his findings. Your neural interface design, one young scientist explained, her eyes bright with admiration, it's not just revolutionary, it's changing everything we thought we knew about treating neurodegeneration. The way it adapts to individual brain chemistry, it's brilliant. Robert, still weak but growing stronger, watched in quiet amazement as years of his work, once dismissed and buried, was finally being recognized. James rarely left his side, fielding calls from medical institutes worldwide, all eager to collaborate on developing the technology. They're calling it the Henderson Protocol, James told him, showing him the headlines on his tablet. Your name is being cleared everywhere. The evidence Judge Morrison uncovered, it's irrefutable. But Robert's thoughts were elsewhere. Could it have saved her? He asked quietly one evening, holding an old photograph of his wife. If they hadn't stopped my research back then. James sat beside his bed, choosing his words carefully. You can't change the past, my friend. But think about how many lives you'll save now. The hospital corridor outside had become a hub of activity. Federal investigators interviewed former colleagues who, seeing which way the wind was blowing, came forward with their own testimonies about the conspiracy to suppress Robert's research. Several major pharmaceutical executives had already resigned, and more indictments were pending. Thomas, who now visited daily, brought news from the company board. They want to establish a research foundation, he told his father. The Robert Henderson Foundation for Neural Research. Full funding, complete academic freedom. They want to make things right. But the most profound changes were happening in smaller, more personal ways. Hospital staff who had once avoided Robert's room now lingered to chat, drawn by his gentle wisdom and humble brilliance. Young medical students began appearing during their breaks, sitting cross-legged on the floor as Robert explained complex neurological concepts in ways that made them feel like children discovering magic for the first time. One evening, as sunset painted the hospital room in warm colors, Robert shared something unexpected with James. I never told you why I stayed near your building all those months, he said, pulling out his worn notebook. I saw you, every morning, helping the cleaning staff carry their equipment up the stairs when the service elevator was broken. Small kindnesses, when you thought no one was watching. I thought if anyone would listen, it would be you. The notebook, when he opened it, contained not just research notes, but something more precious, letters to his wife, written every day since her death. I promised her I wouldn't give up, Robert's voice cracked. Even when I had nothing left, I kept working, kept trying to find a way to help others avoid our fate. As James read the letters, he understood that he had helped save more than just a man's life or his research. He had helped preserve a love story, a promise kept against impossible odds. The true breakthrough wasn't just in the medical technology, but in proving that compassion, when steadfastly maintained, could change the world. But even as Robert's strength returned and his vindication spread through the medical community, none of them realized that the biggest challenge, and the most profound revelation, was yet to come. The final piece of Robert's story would touch not just the medical world, but the very heart of what it means to be human. 1 month after his surgery, Robert stood at a podium in the city's largest medical conference center, facing an audience of thousands. The once homeless man now wore a crisp suit, his silver hair neatly trimmed, but he still carried his weathered notebook, a reminder of the journey that had brought him here. Today, we announce the first successful human trials of the Henderson Protocol, he spoke, his voice steady despite the emotion behind it. 12 patients with advanced neurodegenerative conditions, all showing significant improvement. But this isn't just about medical advancement, it's about human dignity. In the front row, James watched proudly as his friend unveiled the full scope of his life's work. The neural interface technology wasn't just treating individual diseases, it was revolutionizing the entire approach to brain health. Hospitals across the country were already establishing Henderson Protocol centers, making the treatment accessible to patients regardless of their financial status, a non-negotiable condition Robert had insisted upon. But the most powerful moment came when Robert deviated from his prepared speech. 15 years ago, I lost my wife to a disease I knew I could fight. The medical establishment didn't just dismiss my research, they tried to erase me. I ended up on the streets, but I never stopped working, never stopped believing. He paused, looking directly at James. Then one man chose to see me, not as a homeless person, not as a burden on society, but as a human being with value. He risked everything to help me, not knowing if I was even worth helping. That's the real miracle here, not the medical breakthrough, but the breakthrough in human compassion. The impact of Robert's story rippled far beyond the medical community. His experience sparked a nationwide conversation about homelessness, prejudice, and the untapped potential lost to society's snap judgments. The security guard who had tried to remove him from James's building now volunteered at homeless shelters, looking for others whose stories needed to be heard. James's company, under Thomas's leadership, established a foundation that combined medical research with community outreach, understanding that brilliance can be found in the most unexpected places. The board members who had once questioned James's judgment now spoke of him as a visionary who saw value where others saw only liability. But perhaps the most profound change was in the emergency room where their story had begun. A plaque now hung there, bearing a simple message: everyone deserves to be seen. The same reception area where people had once recoiled from a homeless man now served as a reminder that compassion should never be reserved only for those who looked deserving of it. Robert's research would go on to save countless lives, but his story saved something equally precious: people's faith in human dignity. His journey from the streets to medical pioneer became a testament to the power of unwavering kindness and the courage to stand up for what's right, even when standing alone. As for James, he never returned to his CEO position, choosing instead to work alongside Robert in their new foundation. Success isn't about what you gain, he often said, it's about what you give when giving seems foolish. The story of the businessman and the homeless man became more than just a tale of medical triumph. It became a reminder that every person carries within them the potential for greatness, and sometimes all it takes is one person willing to look past the surface and see the humanity beneath. Their legacy wasn't just in the lives saved by the Henderson Protocol, but in the lives changed by their example. In emergency rooms, boardrooms, and street corners across the country, people began to look at each other differently, remembering that the next world-changing breakthrough might come from the person everyone else chose to ignore.